Well, thank you, Ken, for accepting the invitation to have this conversation about your ideas as to what could be the future of the city. And my first question will be about your idea of megaform, as which is something relatively new. You developed it or presented in 1999, and I think it will be interesting to know about the origins of the idea and some more specifics of the idea itself.
Yes, well, I mean, what sort of inspired me to go back to this concept is going to Barcelona and seeing this Ile block on the Avenida Diagonal in Barcelona, designed by Mineo and by Manuel de Sola Morales, and finished in 1992. And I suddenly thought that I think it's like it's a very long block. I think it's almost 800 meters long. What the building does in relation to the existing fabric of the city is to create a landmark that's visible, of course, from the inner suburbs around Barcelona, rather chaotic inner suburbs, and which is a mixed-use building which is multiple floors of offices, and at the grade level there is this large shopping mall, Galleria, inside, and that also supports, the traditional street frontage along the Avenida Diagonal. So, and with parking underneath. So that this particular megaform, is in a way exemplary in as much as it is both a form that has a particular profile, therefore it's also a landmark, and but it has a program inside it which is you could say a mediatory program, in as much as the intense shopping centre reinforces the economic viability of the shops on the Avenida Diagonal and vice versa. And then the multi-level parking underneath allows, for people coming from the suburbs around Barcelona to drive into the city, park underneath, and use the shopping facilities. At the same time, one can gain rather ready access, either as pedestrian or through using public transport, from the existing ensanche of Cerdà, for example, to this site. So it's bonding the city together in different ways, and simultaneously with different programs. So that seemed to me to be an exemplary idea of a megaform, and in a sense it sent me back to an earlier moment in my own development, if you like, when I was somewhat preoccupied with Rockefeller Center, although I never actually made a systematic study of Rockefeller Center. But I had the idea, which I've never pursued, of writing maybe a long essay that would compare the Palais Royal in Paris to Rockefeller Center, seeing both of them as kind of cities in miniature in a way, and as megaforms, in each case within their surrounding urban fabric. So this preoccupation with megaform has a kind of double origin, one much more recent, to do with the Ile block in Barcelona, and one more distant in my own formation.
Okay, and you see that in reading that lecture of '99, you see the megaform as a sort of response to the flatness or the endless expansion of the megalopolis, where there is no place, where there is not element that articulates, that creates a place. Why do you think that this will make a difference, or in what way do you think that will make a difference?
Well, I think that the problem with the megalopolis is that it tends to be a kind of endless proliferation of freestanding objects, none of which is, very few or none of which, there's no relationship between these objects. They're just one freestanding object after another. And they're either, of course, housing blocks, or they're offices, or they can be much smaller, even small houses, but and also occasionally, of course, other uses, factories, industrial plant, warehouses, indeed shopping centres and so on. But there is no, they are objects. They're not really places within the continuity of the megalopolis. And one can think of the megaform as being, really a comprehensive strategy for urban intervention. And it seems to be more and more clear that though we can plan infrastructure in the old master planning sense, we can't really project urban design in any kind of convincing way, because the speed of change is so rapid, and the size of the urban conurbation is so vast. You live in Mexico City. I mean, with these sizes of 23 million, 22 million, whatever, it's very hard to comprehend, these mega cities, in fact. And so the idea is that since, the Gertrude Stein aphorism, there is no more there, is to posit the possibility that one can build a large form which contains a specific program that enables the form and the program to function as a kind of surrogate public domain within a kind of totally privatized proliferation of the megalopolis. And of course you need certain programs to affect this. Well, I mean, in the case of Ile Block, of course, it was a shopping mall and in the main, and there are also other small programs introduced into the same complex, such as schools. But obviously, municipal offices could be used to make a megaform, or universities, or maybe certain transport centres, etc., could constitute the programmatic basis for a megaform. The other aspect of the megaform is, this aspect which I talked about earlier, this question of landmark. In the kind of continuity of the megalopolis, there may be inflections from time to time. There may be clusters of high-rise buildings, but there's very rarely something which distinctly establishes a break in the system. And so the other side of the megaform, I think, is that it should be readable metaphorically as having a kind of topographic character, which is true, of course, of a lot of Aalto's main public buildings. They have this character as though you're not quite sure whether it's a building or it's a geological form. I mean, that could also be said of the Manuel de Sola Morales Ile block, is the profile, the step profile of the block in its length gives it a particular configuration that seems to also to make it readable as a geological metaphor.
So, so one can imagine like a number of megaforms as acupuncture interventions in the city that kind of structure and give and create places in the uniformity of the megalopolis. But not only that, they also distinctive from the rest of the megalopolis in terms of the form, and the form begins to evoke a much more landform construction, kind of much more naturalistic landscape. And how will you see that related to the idea of the green city, which will be much more like a well-established general idea?
Yes, well, Thinking metaphorically, of course, one can look at the megalopolis as a kind of desert, or or more favourably as a continuous forest, and then that of course is kind of by definition green, and indeed, it has been policy, I think, in different places in the world, to encourage tree planting, to even invent financial inducements to plant trees and so on and so forth, so as to actually combat the generation of carbon dioxide, and its role in relation to global warming, etc. So we can think of those kinds of policies as producing, a continuity, at best a kind of green continuity within the megalopolis, as integral to the megalopolis. So in that sense, of course, you can see the megaform as a kind of rupture with, let's say, this kind of green carpet. I mean, at face value, it doesn't. It interrupts the green continuity, let's say. But of course, the megaform could also itself be planted. Could be stepped and planted so that it also would have, let's say, green attributes. But an example would be, and I do, in the second little book I wrote on megaform, I do cite it. Which is the Yokohama ferry terminal by Foreign Office architects, which combines, from a functional point of view, both a ferry terminal and a theatre, and on top a kind of pier promenade cum park, because not in its entirety, but quite a large part of the complex canted roof structure is in fact covered with grass. So here you get hybrid usages and also green conditions, in the one and the same work.
And how do you see an example like the Seattle Sculpture Park by Manfredi Weiss, which is much more like a recreation area? You will combine it, so you will see then the Green City as having different megaforms with different uses and beginning to articulate like a built landscape.
Yeah.
And what can you tell us about, then we're talking about this relationship, nature and culture. What would you see happening there?
Well, in that particular case, Seattle, in fact, I'm going out to Seattle soon. So far I've not seen it, but I know it only from photographs. But, it's also very, it is typical in a way, it's true of Manhattan, for example, that the waterfront of Manhattan was exploited entirely for commercial purposes, or for transatlantic liners and so on. But the actual occupants of the city had no access to the water, basically, and even today, it's still quite difficult to get to the water, except at the very end of the island. And and what's interesting about the Seattle project of Weiss-Manfredi is that exactly that situation existed. That is to say, a freight rail system and a rather dense autoroute system were running parallel, side by side, and still do run parallel side by side, underneath the Olympic Sculpture Park. And before the sculpture park is built, there's no doubt that these two infrastructures constitute an absolute barrier between the population in the city and the piers and the access to the water, running around the perimeter. And by making this sculpture park really a kind of twisted deck into a kind of a sort of Klein bottle solution, above the rail and road infrastructure, they were able to bring the population from the city out to the water's edge. So there was a compensatory, it was a kind of compensatory project which, was able to fulfill its need, fulfill the need almost immediately.
So what we're talking about is then this strategy of the megaforum also being used to solve the disruption that some public transportation or some transportation lines brings into the city. And but now that we're talking about transportation, I think that it will be very interesting to hear again what you had to say about the tram in Zurich, because then we're talking about something that will complement, I think, the idea of bringing the city back to the inhabitant of the city as a much more adequate habitat, not only through the building up and the articulation of the city through the green megaforms, but also something that is inherently disruptive, that is the transportation systems.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about it this morning, that the interesting thing that Ildefonso Cerdà says in 1867, when he writes his general theory of urbanization, he says that the science of urbanization is based on locomotion. And I was thinking about this and the way in which, the traditional city, the traditional walled city, is very much, relatively speaking, a static assembly of built form. And the way in which the walled city, the urbanized continuity facilitated by the automobile, of course, is very much not static, it's dynamic, it's a kind of continuous process. And so transportation has is unavoidable. I mean, in the megalopolis, transportation is absolutely essential to the megalopolis, and you could make the case that the only thing that really unifies the megalopolis is the continuous autoroute transportation system, mostly autoroute. And I recently had this experience in Zurich, which I was relating to you, which concerns the tram system in Zurich. It's quite obvious that the Swiss are never going to give up the tram system in Zurich. It just will go on forever. In fact, they're still extending it. But what is amazing about the tram, I think, in relation to the city and to pedestrian movement, is that there is some kind of symbiotic relationship between the speed of walking and the speed of a tram. And moreover, the tram on a fixed rail creates a kind of perceptual relationship between the movement of the tram and the built fabric through which it is passing, so that you have a kind of a panoramic perception, or that is a moving panoramic perception that also has a certain spatial and temporal aspect to it, as the tram passes through the city. I mean, I think you can feel this very, very immediately in the case of the Zurich tram system. And the other amazing thing about it, I think, is that the speed, which is not so fast and is somehow related to the speed of walking. I mean, it's of course faster than the speed of walking, but I mean in terms of the spacing between the tram stops and the time it takes for the tram to pass from one stop to another, there's a way in which that rhythm seems to be related to the walking rhythm, and that, plus the fact that in Zurich the tram has precedence over the automobile, so it keeps the trams flowing, and one has the feeling that the whole system of transport is a kind of almost liquid. It's kind of a continuous flow that is passing through the city, and is like set against the flow of pedestrian movement. And what is, I think, remarkable there is the way in which these two things, the mechanical transportation system and the spontaneous movement of pedestrians, have a kind of uncanny symbiotic relationship to each other. Then the people seem to know how to move, They don't, for example, trip over the rails, You can imagine if you were to reintroduce trams into the urban fabric of, let's say, Manhattan, there'd be a lot of fuss about, people trip over the rails. Nobody trips over the rails in Zurich. The rails, of course, are very beautifully laid. They're very flush with the surface. They're very discreet. It would be hard to trip over them. They're not really above the surface. They're in the surface. All those things, I think, it's hard to imagine I will ever in my lifetime, what's left of it, encounter a tram system as elegant as that. In any case, there are very few tram systems altogether. We know from the point of view of investment that, fixed rail systems, even tram systems, are more expensive than, let's say, buses without rails, as in Curitiba in Brazil and also the Transmilenio system in Bogota, where the investment is, less. I think it's fine. It's very ingenious, the system, the designated bus lane system in Curitiba, but you don't have this kind of symbiotic relationship between the character of the space and the system of transportation.
Mm-hmm. You know that there has been the system of Curitiba has been applied to Mexico, and now we have in Mexico metro buses.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah. Which is, but I agree with you that doesn't have the same kind of symbiotic relationship with the pedestrian that the tram does.
No.
And then there are examples of trams being laid on the roots of grass in a way, like in Barcelona or in Rotterdam.
Yes.
So then we will have these megaforms being like artificial landscapes, and then or megaforms covering in being bridges over metropolitan routes, and then we will have these routes of trams being green, and then there are other strategies like say the High Line here.
Yeah, that's right.
And or the waterfall that exists on, I think, 50th Street between Lexington and 3rd.
Yeah, that's right.
And what can you say about all these extra strategies, sort of to make a city that is green but is not homogeneous as the megalopolis?
Yes, yes. Well, they are also insertions in a way, aren't they? They are interventions.
Yes.
And the one, the High Line is very beautiful work, I think, also from the point of view of reuse of industrial elevated rail system. The only I think downside of the High Line is that there's no amenity up there on the at the level of the High Line. There's no. You have to go down to find the city, so to speak, and go back up again. You don't. That's a pity, I think, because. And it's an old story because when in the 60s there were projects in which there was a separation of traffic, and like for example the Alison and Peter Smithson's Hauptstadt Berlin project, where the traffic is at grade and there are pedestrian areas elevated above the traffic. Their whole Berlin plan is dependent on this idea. But we know that if you don't have anything to attract the public, like restaurants or similar facilities at the elevated level, then nobody will go there. So you have these kind of platforms that are entirely deserted. That was, in the 60s one discovered that, this unfortunate phenomenon. So, and the High Line, of course, is very beautifully landscaped. It's not just a dead platform, but nonetheless, it lacks some kind of amenity at that level, which would give it a kind of meaning and life which otherwise it doesn't have.
So you would say that if we continue, putting elements to this imaginary habitat, we could have High Lines that are not reuse of an existing industrial infrastructure, but we could think about building new High Lines, but that will have to connect the city or the megaforms at another level so as to bring in amenities and not just making like a a passage.
Yes, yes.
And thinking about roof gardens, green walls that are now fashionable. Well, I mean, the idea of the green of the roof garden is a quite old one, no?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, yes. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, right? Yes.
Right.
Yes. Or Le Corbusier's Jardin Suspendu. You know, it's also, of course, a hanging garden. And yes, this idea of the idea of planting roofs, you know, which I think there have been some initiatives in Manhattan to do that, not sufficiently sustained, I think. You know, obviously, you can start a whole movement and keep it going through, I don't know, different kinds of financial inducements to encourage people to actually plant the roofs, you know. And then, I mean, the big advantage to doing that, apart from literally providing green and then a sort of quasi-natural environment on top of the building, but also you combat the heat island effect, you know, this build-up of heat, and, you know, particularly where you have almost all the roofs are covered in blacktop, you know, so there's an absorption of heat and a radiant heat from the sun and a build-up of heat as the owners of the equipment, you know, well, you know, they benefit from you know, I mean, there's a double benefit. On the one hand, of course, they're benefiting from the possibility you can grow food on the roof, you know, so you have a kind of local horticulture, if you like, you know, on the roof, and at the same time you're combating the heat island effect. So these two things together, and also if you happen to see the city from above, of course, you see, instead of seeing black roofs, you see green, you know. So this is a kind of literal greening of the city.
Yes,
I think, you know?
yes.
And well, I mean,
Yes.
it's obviously also another strategy.
Yes. Do you know the green roof of the parking lot of the Kaiser Aluminium Company in Auckland?
No, I don't.
It's fantastic. It's from the 50s and it's on the 7th floor, and it has very tall trees and fountains and you up there and you just forget that you are you know up high.
Yeah.
But why do you think that? Why hasn't become more popular? I mean, it's such an old idea, and it has very good examples of being implemented well, and it's now only that it's coming to be fashionable. It's the overall circumstances, global warming.
Yes. Well, maybe that is you know, has woken, you know, people have woken up perhaps to the environmental crisis, and they are, amongst other things, adopting the idea of green roofs as a way of dealing with that. I mean, right? You know, also, of course, it raises another issue: is that the roofs can also be used for harvesting rainwater, for example. You know,
You're right.
You know, so that you know, they're both they can be one at the same time both aqueous roofs and you know, and sort of be reservoirs, small reservoirs. You know? I mean, you know, I suppose you in order for it to become general, you need to have some inducement. I mean, either people get rebates on their mortgages, or they have to have some inducement to put the effort in to make the garden on the roof, I think. Particularly when you think of apartment buildings where there are many apartments inside. And it's the co-op as a whole that will benefit from the roof garden. Usually these roof gardens cannot be divided up efficiently into one unit per dwelling unit, for example.
Right.
So they are potential collective green spaces on the top of buildings, and then they also, depending on the inherent familiarity of the architect to whoever, you know, the familiarity of the of the figure with people who happen to be up there, for example, the kind of familial relationship, that also can be facilitated or encouraged by green roofs, I think.
Yeah, and then there is this idea of the vertical forest. Have you heard of it? There is a 10 stories high building that extends its balconies so as to become terraces that are planted, and so all the facade becomes like green.
Yeah.
So
yes.
What do you say?
Very early on, for example, outside Madrid, this complex called Torres Blancas,
Right.
Sainz-de-Oyster.
That is close to the Ile.
It's very close to
yes,
Ile Block.
Yes.
And it has this cascading green coming down, from one balcony to another. It's a residential tower, isn't it? And based on Wright, of course. It's a Wrightian, neo-Wrightian building by Sainz-de-Oyster. And there is green cascading down from one balcony to the next.
Right.
The full height of the tower.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of vertical green.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so basically, what you're saying is that in order to make these kind of cities come true, one will have to have legislation. One would have to have tax incentives, financial incentives, and but before that, architects and planners will have to push for that.
Yes.
And that is, you see that happening, or
not too much? I don't think. Not here, anyway.
No. And why do you think is that? If, on the other hand, we all worried about global warming and deterioration of the environment, and why is that the profession is not more active about changing the habitat?
Yes. Don't know the answer. I mean, it's just it's backward from that point of view. It's really backward. And you're saying, why doesn't it take more public initiative to?
Right. I mean, I think at the beginning of the 20th century, architects and planners were very propositive in terms of creating a new habitat that will respond to the conditions. And then in the 60s, the utopists kind of also imagined perhaps the mega structures in the cities they imagined were kind of crazy, but still they responded to the conditions, the overall conditions of the world.
Yes, yes.
And now, as you said, we like staying behind.
Well, maybe it's perhaps it's got to do with the fact that architects who always associate themselves with newness or with a new project, and also with kind of utopian notions, don't get so excited about a condition which is basically remedial. It may be the fact that to do green roofs or walls of green, is to emphasize the remedial aspect, and it's a remedial project, and maybe architects don't feel so excited about a remedial project. That's perhaps.
But yes, I agree with you. But then it is remedial in the sense that because we really haven't come clear as to our role as professionals.
Yes.
And our role is to create the most possible living environment and habitat. And clearly what we've done so far doesn't seem to be as efficient as it could.
Yeah.
And the remedial will bring the solution to its best situation, right?
Yeah.
And do you want to close our conversation with your when we were having lunch, with your reflection of the oasis that I like very much?
Yes, I mean, well, there are two issues I think we haven't touched on. One is this question of acupuncture, and the other is this question of oasis. And well, I thought about this possible opposition between oasis and caravanserai. There, I mean, I think it's possible to use metaphors like this, and they do help one to well, conceive an image and also carry an idea forward. And I think that, for me, the caravanserai is quintessentially a kind of public work. It contains within it this idea, this phrase which I've always admired of Hannah Arendt's, space of public appearance. And yes, buildings which have this. Well, I'm thinking of certain examples. Well, the Ila Block in Barcelona is one, but also the Robson Square complex in Vancouver by Arthur Erickson, and also the Simon Fraser University by Arthur Erickson just outside Vancouver, are in their different ways, the three things I've mentioned, they incorporate public spaces within their overall body, their overall form. In that sense, they could be seen, quote unquote, as caravanserai, in as much as they provide within their domain spaces of public appearance, which means, of course, uses of public appearance. I mean, cafes or public meeting spaces, lecture halls. In the case of the Robson Square in Vancouver, there is a kind of marriage hall. It's actually underneath a waterfall. This metaphor caravanserai can be used to stand for this idea, and can be in and of itself a significant urban intervention, I think, related, of course, to the fabric of the city, but not absolutely hermetic, but nonetheless a kind of decisively separate domain, And the oasis as a metaphor has much more the idea of a garden, of a kind of green, quasi-natural environment, which is meant for resuscitating oneself through contact with nature, even if that nature has a certain artificial character.
Right.
As within, of course, the long-standing public park tradition, So these two genres, if you like, metaphorically identified with oasis on one hand and caravanserai on the other, can be a way of thinking about urban intervention in general, I think. The megalopolis as we find it. The other thing I think that's also a very valid idea and also somewhat metaphorical is the idea of urban acupuncture, which is, of course, also based upon the idea of urban intervention. That is the intervention. These interventions are acupunctural. They can. And the metaphor acupuncture, which was coined, I think, simultaneously by Manuel de Sola Morales on the one hand and Jaime Lerner in Curitiba on the other. This metaphor, presupposes a kind of catalytic effect, that you build something at a particular point in the urban fabric, having a particular program, and you expect it to have some kind of catalytic effect on the immediate society, And because just to sum up, the metaphor of acupuncture presupposes, of course, urban interventions at particular points, which can only be, there again, they must always generally involve realizations over a fairly limited period of time, when you have a certain amount of money to invest in that realization, and when that money is spent, building stops. The intervention is it's completed for the moment,
right.
And the consequences of the intervention can't be entirely foreseen. There's a certain open-endedness about it.
Right.
And that of course gives the metaphor its meaning, because it's as though the the analogy is that the city is some kind of a body that by operating on certain acupuncture points, you can affect the overall circulation or well-being of the body, etc., etc. So,
so I mean, summing up, we could see the megaforms as these strong interventions in the city, strong acts of acupuncture that at the same time become oases and kind of affect eventually the area where they stand, and at the same time the agglomeration of those in the city begin to articulate the city in a different way and begin to change the face of the city, so as to not only these like green forests, but a city that also has new mountains that are megaforms, green megaforms that are connected with new kinds of transportation, and also like new high lines at different levels and something like that.
Yeah, right. Yes.
And last question: Will that create a new land kind of settlement?
Yes, I mean, well, there we are. And I'm picking up on the fact that in a previous conversation, I suggested, that the megaform in and of itself doesn't really address the issue of land settlement. And there, what interests me are two things. One is I've long been advocate of low-rise high-density housing. And in fact, in 1972, I was involved in this low-rise high-density housing project in Brownsville, Brooklyn, sponsored by the Urban Development Corporation. This is 1972. And we built 600 units there, we being the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, etc., etc. And and that is, you could say, as a piece of low-rise high-density housing, is an attempt to formulate a kind of new pattern of land settlement in relation to, in this case, pre-existing Brooklyn grid. But I think that, and indeed, this project of 72 was in fact influenced to some extent by the famous Siedlung Harlem housing outside of Lucerne, and where if you look at it from the air, you can see that it's a kind of enclave. It's rather dense. It's row houses. It's a very dense settlement of row houses. Also, the roofs are planted, etc., etc. And it also is kind of a bit isolated in that the whole point is it is isolated, so that it's just a one-off, And in fact, this Siedlung Harlem was designed by Atelier 5, and I think the completion date is 1960. But from this point onwards until today, Atelier 5, which still continues as a practice. In fact, the original partners are either retired or no longer alive. But they set up the whole partnership so that there would be succeeding generations keeping the partnership alive. And that partnership has continued to build housing for middle class Swiss, and also a little bit in Austria and in Germany. It's gone on building this low-rise high density. Not perhaps as canonically, let's say, as the Siedlung Harlem, but nevertheless still a very interesting exemplary model of an alternative pattern of land settlement. And something similar, of course, was achieved in Austria by Roland Reiner, who actually wrote an amazing book that was published in 1972 with the title Livable Environments, which was a kind of ecological low-rise high density. It advanced a kind of ecological low-rise high density thesis. And he would build over a 20-year period, one settlement after another on the banks of the Danube, just outside of Linz, this settlement known as Puckenau. That would be 20 years of continuous production, And I think that those those do represent, within the genre of low-rise high density, alternative patterns of land settlement.
Okay.
But more recently, I've come to think that that cannot be the only pattern of land settlement, you know.
Right.
And that there has emerged in Switzerland and Austria a certain typology of between 6 and 8 story high cubic apartment blocks, you know, that are usually designed so that the position of the blocks in relation to each other has a kind of order to it. You know? And where you don't have identifiable individual units. You don't have that kind of development which the Germans once called carpet housing.
Mm-hmm.
You have sort of anonymous, rather urbane blocks of a very not overwhelming in scale, and not building on the site with sort of too much density from the point of view of from the in such a building in such an open way that you can penetrate, the air can move between the buildings, and pedestrian movement can pass between the buildings, and the site can be landscaped accordingly. You know, that to my mind also represents embryonically an alternative pattern of land settlement.
Right.
But I think this question of arriving at patterns of land settlement which are not suburban, you know, and are not wasteful, both psychologically and otherwise, of human resources, you know, is a crying need, really. We desperately need to develop alternative land settlement patterns.
Mm. I think you mentioned once the biker upon time.
Yes, the biker wall.
Which has a different kind of topographic form, and at the same time combines low-rise units and high-rise, and that could be. You could see that like another.
I suppose with the biker wall, you are touching on a kind of interface between concerns to do with alternative patterns of land settlement on the one hand, and ideas that are more connected to the megaform as a kind of identifiable landmark on the other, to attempt to synthesize the two. Yes.
Yeah, so you will have the megaform, you will have these kind of examples, and then you will have the other ones you previously mentioned.
Yes.
Well, you want to add anything else, Ken?
Well, I think we kind of did it, didn't we?
I
did. We covered it. Yeah.
Well,
for the moment, we covered it.
For the moment, thank you very much,
Okay.
and I appreciate it very much, and I'm sure the audience will love it.
I hope so. Yeah, we'll see. Okay.
Thank
Good.
you.
Great. Thanks.